For 8 years, a mother went to bed every night, not knowing if her daughter was alive or dead. 8 years of unanswered calls, empty holidays, and a question that haunted every breath she took. Then, beneath a quiet suburban basement, the truth finally surfaced, not by accident, but because someone had buried their secret in concrete. What followed would unravel a story of trust betrayed, lives destroyed, and a cold case that refused to stay buried. For 8 long years, Dorothy Sullivan lived with a pain that never rested. Every morning, she woke up hoping to hear her daughter's voice. Every night, she went to bed wondering if Jennifer was cold, hungry, afraid, or maybe safe somewhere far away. The not knowing was the hardest part. It was like a wound that never closed. Friends tried to comfort her. They told her to stay strong. Some quietly believed Jennifer had run away. But Dorothy never accepted that. A mother knows. Jennifer wasn't the type to disappear without a word. She had a family she loved, a boyfriend she planned a future with, a life she cared about. Dorothy held on to hope, even when that hope felt like it was slowly crushing her. Then one ordinary afternoon, everything changed. The phone rang. It was a call Dorothy had both prayed for and dreaded for years. A police officer spoke gently, asking if she could come in to talk. She knew before they said a word that the search was over. At the police station, Dorothy sat in a small room with 2 detectives. Their faces were serious, kind, but heavy with the weight of what they had to say. They told her that remains had been found buried under a concrete basement floor. They believed the remains were Jennifer Sitt's. In that moment, Dorothy Sepp's world went silent. For years, she imagined every possible outcome. Jennifer alive somewhere. Jennifer calling home one day. Jennifer starting a new life. But she had never truly imagined this moment, the moment hope would finally break. She should have been shattered. Instead, something inside her shifted. It wasn't relief, not exactly. And it wasn't peace. But it was an ending to the endless torture of uncertainty. Jennifer was gone. She hadn't chosen to leave. She hadn't started a new life. She'd been murdered and hidden. Dorothy cried until she couldn't sit anymore. The pain was sharp, but for the first time it had a shape. She no longer had to wonder if Jennifer was suffering, if she was out there somewhere needing help. The unknown had been replaced with something devastating but real. Forensic experts began the careful process of examining the remains. The body had been under concrete for nearly 8 years. The concrete had slowed down the decomposition, but time had still left its mark. Despite the damage, investigators found enough evidence to learn how Jennifer had died. The medical examiner Sitt's report was clear. Jennifer's death had been caused by blunt force trauma to the skull, a single powerful blow to the left side of her head. It was likely from a heavy object, something like a wrench or a metal pipe. The blow would have knocked her unconscious immediately and killed her within minutes. There were no signs she had suffered for hours. Her death was quick. If there was any comfort for Dorothy, it was knowing that Jennifer hadn't lived through a long, drawn-out agony. When Dorothy left the station that day, the world looked the same, but everything had changed. The hope she'd carried for 8 years was gone, replaced by a different kind of weight. She now knew the truth, and with that truth came a new mission: justice for her daughter. With Jennifer's remains finally found, the case that had once gone cold suddenly came alive again. For 8 years, the investigation had sat in dusty files moved from one detective's desk to another. Leads had dried up. Witnesses had moved away. Some officers who once worked on the case had even retired. But now, everything had changed. There was finally evidence, and that meant there was finally a chance to uncover the truth. The police department decided to reopen the investigation and assigned it to a man who had never truly let the case go, retired Detective Martin Fisher. Martin was a seasoned investigator who had worked on Jennifer's case when she first disappeared. Even after retirement, he had always felt a personal connection to it. Something about Jennifer's case had haunted him. He'd always believed the answer was close, just buried deeper than anyone realized. When he heard about the discovery of Jennifer's remains, Martin didn't hesitate. He came back as a consultant, determined to finish what he started. This time, there would be no loose ends. The first step was to look carefully at where Jennifer's body had been found. It was buried beneath a concrete basement floor in a suburban home. The house had once belonged to a quiet woman named Ruth Henderson, who had lived there alone for decades. Ruth had passed away the year before, and her property was being renovated by a new owner. It was during that renovation that workers broke through the basement floor and made the horrifying discovery. Martin and the investigative team pulled up old property records to learn who had access to that house back in 1973. They discovered that Ruth Henderson had hired a local contractor, a man named Thomas Walsh, to do repair work on the basement around the same time Jennifer disappeared. That immediately caught their attention. Thomas Walsh was well known in the neighborhood as a hard-working man. He had a clean record and a friendly reputation. But records showed something interesting. Thomas hadn't done all the work alone. He often brought in his younger brother, Gregory Walsh, to help him with heavy labor. Gregory was not a contractor. He worked at the city airport as a maintenance supervisor, a job that gave him access to tools, vehicles, and hidden areas few others knew about. Martin Sitt's instincts kicked in. Why would someone who worked at an airport help with basement work? It didn't quite fit. The team began piecing together timelines. They reviewed Jennifer Sitt's last known movements. She was last seen near the airport, heading home after visiting a friend. Gregory Walsh worked at that same airport. The connection was subtle, but it was there. Martin decided it was time to interview Thomas Walsh. He was older now, with a quiet life. At first, he acted surprised that the police were revisiting something from so long ago. He admitted to working on Ruth Henderson's house, but insisted he didn't know anything about Jennifer. But when detectives asked about his brother Gregory, Thomas's body language shifted ever so slightly. It was small, a tightened jaw, a quick glance away, but to an experienced detective like Martin, it was a red flag. Meanwhile, forensic teams searched through old storage records, city archives, and airport logs. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Gregory Walsh had been working late shifts during the time Jennifer disappeared. He had access to places where no one would question his presence. And more importantly, he had access to tools capable of delivering a single fatal blow. After 8 long years, the puzzle pieces were finally beginning to connect. The discovery of Jennifer's remains had reopened a door everyone thought was sealed forever. And behind that door, the name Gregory Walsh was starting to stand out. With the investigation reopened and new names surfacing, the detectives knew this was the moment that could change everything. The discovery of Jennifer's body had given them fresh direction. Now they needed proof, something solid that would turn suspicion into certainty. The focus shifted to Gregory Walsh, the airport maintenance supervisor who had quietly slipped through the cracks 8 years earlier. On the surface, Gregory lived an ordinary life. He was married to Karen, had a steady job, and kept to himself. But as detectives began digging into his past, small cracks started to appear in the picture he had built. Detectives invited Gregory for questioning, presenting it as a routine interview. He walked into the station calm and confident, dressed neatly, answering questions politely. At first glance, he seemed like a man with nothing to hide. But trained investigators looked beyond words. They watched the eyes, the hands, the breathing, and as the conversation went deeper, Gregory's mask began to slip. When detectives asked him where he was on the night Jennifer disappeared, Gregory gave vague answers. He said he was probably at work but couldn't recall details. For most people, a random night 8 years ago might blur together. But for someone connected to a murder, that vagueness meant something more. His hands fidgeted, his jaw clenched, his breathing quickened just slightly. Detective Martin Fisher, who had returned to help, watched Gregory closely. He'd spent decades interviewing suspects, and he could sense the tension. Gregory wasn't panicking, but he was calculating, choosing his words carefully, almost rehearsed. Martin knew this wasn't just a nervous man. This was someone hiding a truth. As the questioning continued, detectives carefully revealed pieces of information without giving too much away. They mentioned the basement discovery. They asked about his brother Thomas and the house renovation. Gregory denied everything, said he only helped a little, that he barely remembered being there. But behind those denials, Martin saw fear flicker. Meanwhile, the forensic team and investigators executed search warrants for both Gregory's home and the old airport maintenance storage areas. What they found changed everything. Hidden in a dusty corner of Gregory's old work locker, wrapped in layers of cloth, was a heavy metal wrench. It looked aged, but it had traces of blood and old concrete dust on it. Forensic analysis later matched the blood to Jennifer Sullivan. The blow to Jennifer's head had been delivered by something just like that wrench. But that wasn't all. In Gregory's personal belongings, police discovered a box containing old photographs, newspaper clippings, and a small notebook. The photos were unsettling. They included candid shots of Jennifer near the airport taken days before she disappeared. The notebook had scattered, disturbing notes, fragmented thoughts, dates, and cryptic references to the basement. Each piece of evidence built a picture Gregory could no longer hide from. The polite, calm maintenance man was now at the center of a murder investigation. With the evidence mounting, detectives brought Gregory in again, this time not for a casual talk, but for a formal interrogation. The atmosphere was different. The room was quiet. The detectives were direct. They laid the wrench on the table. They showed him the photographs. For the first time, Gregory's calm exterior cracked. His hands trembled slightly. He avoided eye contact. He still denied involvement, but the hesitation in his voice grew with every question. The once cold case was now burning hot, and Gregory Walsh was running out of lies. The breakthrough had finally arrived. After years of silence, the truth was beginning to surface, not through confessions, but through undeniable evidence. And the man who had lived freely for 8 years was about to face the past he thought he had buried in concrete. The moment of truth had finally arrived. After weeks of questioning, forensic work, and mounting evidence, Gregory Walsh was sitting across from detectives in the interrogation room, no longer as a helpful witness, but as the man they believed had killed Jennifer Sullivan. The air in the room was heavy. Detective Martin Fisher leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. On the table lay the wrench wrapped in clear evidence, plastic, the photographs Gregory had secretly taken of Jennifer, and the notebook with his cryptic entries. Gregory stared at them, silent, like a man staring at a door slowly closing behind him. At first, Gregory repeated what he had said before. He denied everything. He claimed he didn't know Jennifer personally, that the wrench could belong to anyone, that the photos were old camera experiments. But the detectives didn't rush. They let the silence speak. They showed him forensic reports, timelines, and witness statements. They connected every dot, patiently and relentlessly. Then something shifted. It wasn't sudden. It was like watching a dam slowly crack under pressure. Gregory's eyes began to water. His shoulders slumped. For the first time, he stopped fighting the truth. He lowered his head, took a deep breath, and whispered, "I didn't mean for it to happen." The room fell quiet. This was the confession Martin Fisher had waited 8 years to hear. Gregory began to explain what had happened on that night in 1973. Jennifer had passed by the airport after visiting a friend. Gregory had noticed her before. He admitted he found her pretty and had even followed her a few times without her knowing. On that night, he saw her walking alone and decided to approach her. He claimed he only wanted to talk, but when she rejected his advance and tried to leave, he panicked. In his own words, "I grabbed the wrench to scare her, but she screamed. I hit her, just once, and she fell." The single blow to Jennifer's head had been fatal. Gregory didn't check for help. He didn't call anyone. Instead, he froze, then decided to hide what he had done. He drove Jennifer's body to the airport maintenance area where no one would notice him late at night. He kept the body there for several days, wrapped and hidden, while he figured out what to do next. That's when he called his brother Thomas Walsh for help. Thomas had always looked up to Gregory. When Gregory told him it was an accident and begged for help, Thomas agreed. He had been doing basement work at Ruth Henderson's house at the time. Late one night, the two brothers carried Jennifer's body to the house, dug a shallow pit in the basement, and buried her beneath fresh concrete. No one saw them. No one heard a thing. For 8 years, that basement floor hid the truth. But there was another person who knew, Karen Walsh, Gregory's wife. A few weeks after the murder, Gregory had broken down and told her everything. Instead of going to the police, she chose silence. She lived with the secret, protecting her husband while Dorothy Sullivan searched endlessly for her daughter. Once Gregory confessed, detectives moved quickly. Both Thomas Walsh and Karen Walsh were brought in for questioning. Thomas admitted to helping bury the body but insisted he had nothing to do with the killing itself. Karen broke down during her interview. The guilt she had carried for years spilled out in tears. The consequences came swiftly. Gregory Walsh was charged with murder. Thomas Walsh faced charges for being an accessory after the fact, and Karen was charged for obstruction of justice for keeping silent all these years. The confessions that had taken nearly a decade to reach finally shattered the silence surrounding Jennifer's disappearance. The truth was dark, tragic, and painful, but it was finally out. After years of pain, unanswered questions, and sleepless nights, the truth about Jennifer Sullivan's disappearance was finally in the open. The confessions had shocked the community. For years, Gregory Walsh had lived quietly among them, a husband, a worker, a neighbor. No one had ever suspected that the man fixing lights at the airport and mowing his lawn on weekends had buried a terrible secret beneath concrete. The legal process moved forward quickly. The evidence was strong. Forensic proof, the wrench, the photographs, the timeline, and Gregory's own confession. The prosecution built a clear, undeniable case. The courtroom was packed almost every day. Neighbors, reporters, and families who had followed Jennifer's story for years filled the benches. For Dorothy Sullivan, walking into that courtroom was one of the hardest things she had ever done. But she was determined to face the man who had stolen her daughter's life. During the trial, Gregory's lawyers tried to argue that the killing wasn't premeditated. They described it as a moment of panic, hoping to reduce the sentence. But the judge and jury saw the entire picture: the stalking, the violence, the deliberate cover-up, and 8 years of silence. This was not just a mistake, it was a choice that changed lives forever. After weeks of emotional testimony and careful deliberation, Gregory Walsh was found guilty of murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thomas Walsh, for his role in helping bury Jennifer's body, received a 15-year sentence for being an accessory after the fact. Karen Walsh, who had kept the truth hidden for nearly a decade, received 5 years for obstruction of justice. The sentencing brought tears to many in the courtroom. Some cried for Jennifer. Some cried for Dorothy, who had carried the weight of the unknown for so long. And some cried for the shocking reality that ordinary people had been capable of such terrible decisions. For Dorothy Sullivan, the verdict was not a victory. There was no joy in watching Gregory go to prison. No punishment could bring Jennifer back. But it was justice, something she had feared might never come. For the first time in 8 years, she could breathe without wondering. She could speak Jennifer's name, knowing the world finally knew what had happened. A few months later, Dorothy held a small private funeral for Jennifer. The remains that had been hidden under a basement for so long were laid to rest with dignity. Family and friends gathered to say goodbye, sharing memories of Jennifer's kindness, laughter, and dreams. Dorothy stood beside her daughter's grave, her hands trembling, but her heart a little lighter. The long chapter of uncertainty had finally closed. The case didn't just affect one family, it led to major changes in the city. Airport security protocols were reevaluated. Background checks for maintenance staff were strengthened. The police department introduced new methods for reviewing cold cases, ensuring no file would be forgotten so easily again. Detective Martin Fisher, who had carried the case in his heart for years, finally felt the weight lift. As he stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing, reporters surrounded him asking how he felt. He simply said, "This was for Jennifer, and for her mother. Some cases don't let you rest until the truth is found." For Dorothy, life would never be the same. She would always miss Jennifer, her smile, her voice, her presence at the dinner table. But now, when she visited her daughter's grave, she could talk to her knowing the world finally heard her story. The case of Jennifer Sullivan became a reminder to the entire community. Truth can be buried, but it can't stay hidden forever. Not under concrete, not under lies, not even after 8 long years. Jennifer Sullivan's story reminds us that the truth can be hidden but never erased. For 8 long years, one family lived in the darkness of uncertainty, while those responsible lived ordinary lives built on silence and lies. But justice, though delayed, found its way through persistence, evidence, and the refusal to give up. If stories like this matter to you, and if you believe that every voice deserves to be heard and every victim remembered, make sure you follow for more real cases where the truth eventually comes to light. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures that justice is never forgotten.